Some quick fun facts about Born in Jerusalem and Still Alive before we begin. The Makuya Japanese that you saw in the film are a real thing. We don't know how many there are, but there are more than 300,000 Japanese subscribe to the Makuya newsletter. Thousands have been on pilgrimages to Israel. More than 1,000 of their students have attended classes or graduated from Israeli universities. Here you see them studying for Leil Tikkun Shavuot. They study in the universities. They study archaeology, Bible, and Jewish thought, and their mastery of Hebrew is said to be amazing. The lead character of Ronen in the movie is played by the first-time writer-director Yossi Attia, who based the script on his real life. So the guy who wrote the movie is the lead actor. Like his protagonist, Attia grew up in the center of Jerusalem, lived through the bombings, and was haunted by nightmares and fears. He actually started leading tours as a way of coping. For years, he tried to make a documentary about his tours, but it didn't work out. Then he made it into a short comedy, and ultimately he fictionalized his story, adding the romantic subplot, and brought it to the veteran Israeli filmmaker David Ofek, who co-directed the film with him. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Stevan Hobfoll. He's a leading authority on stress and resiliency. He has published 14 books on the topic and more than 300 research papers and book chapters. He has consulted with some of the world's largest corporations, armies, and nations. His 5 principles of mass casualty response is the world standard for responding to major disasters and large-scale traumatic events, something we are all too sadly seeing once again in the news. So with that, I welcome Stevan Hobfoll. Thank you.
Thank you. I also should mention, I'll give you a brief biography now. I grew up in Chicago. So I lived in Albany Park, which probably there's some of you might have lived there, or perhaps your parents lived there, because it's where Jews were, at least at one time in Chicago. I was a no good for nothing. And so when I was usually turned away at the border to Highland Park if I tried to go there to date a girl in high school, but I've more or less reformed. I live now in Utah in the mountains and lived in Israel for many years. I'll go into that a bit now. I first started going to Israel when I was 20, fell in love with the country, fell in love with a girl. The girl didn't work out. She was a very nice young woman, but it was young to have a serious relationship. But the relationship with the country very much worked out. And I moved there with my wife after getting my doctorate in psychology, after many trips back and forth. I was would be in the US, an assistant professor at Ben Gurion University. And then I was at the time the youngest professor, in other words, full professor rank ever at Tel Aviv University. Like every Israeli, I was drafted into the army. A notice arrives and you show up, and I became an officer in the Israeli Defense Forces until the time of my leaving. And then I re-engaged with the Israeli security apparatus, which is a code word that I can't tell you much about that, for the next 20 years, going back and forth, spending usually a couple months a year in Israel, especially during the 2 intifadas. There were 2 intifadas. The one that this film is about relates to the second intifada. So that's probably enough about me. If anyone has a question at any time, I'm going to plan on just about 20 minutes of remarks, 15, 20 minutes. That's where Udi has instructed me. To ask a professor to only speak for 15 minutes is near impossible. And then to ask a Jewish professor to speak for only 15 minutes is certainly impossible, but I'll try to keep to the task. So, I'm sure we each had our own reactions to this film. I witnessed it on two levels that I'm going to talk about briefly. One is the society level, and then is the personal level of the main protagonist, Ronan, and who he is, as we would see it psychiatrically, psychologically. He it's kind of a nebbish. He's socially maladroit. He is, like a lot of we men, helped out by a woman who is socially much more well adapted. It still doesn't work out great for him, it seems. He also apparently has PTSD, which we could probably figure on the whole film, but he only divulges that at the end where he says, he kept avoiding, they kept going by the Sbarro, is that how it said? Restaurant, the pizza restaurant. And if you remember in the film, a couple of times he goes by there, and one time at least someone asks him, what about this? And he says, well, we're not going to talk about that one. I think that's where he says, this is why I don't have Israelis participate, because they're pushy and think they know better. But we find out towards the very end of the film that he was there outside the restaurant when that terrible terrorist attack occurred there. And in his words, he watched as buckets of blood poured out, which means that he saw mangled and dead bodies and severely injured people in what was one of the worst of the terrorist attacks. It is not that uncommon for people with PTSD to try to work through their PTSD by doing a journey of constantly talking about the trauma, which is what he does in the tours. I've worked with this with, for example, mothers of drunk drivers who lost children in drunk driving. They never get through their PTSD by doing this. It's a route of doing something, but it's not really a route of recovery. We're given some hints at the very end that he is somehow experiencing recovery by doing what? He's finally done doing the tours, and his even greater nebbish friend is going to take over and run it as a business, charging now for it. On the level of the society, it was certainly a horrific period, especially the Second Intifada. There were over 15,000 missile strikes, endless terrorist attacks, mainly hitting Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, but also other places. The missile attacks, because the rockets are rather inaccurate, were more likely to hit Sderot and Ashkelon in the south. I'm going to guess that all of you have been to Israel, or nearly all. Ashkelon is on the coast in the south, just above Gaza, and Sderot, which you probably didn't go to, is a development town with mainly North African Jews just east of Gaza, both within easy rocket range. Because Israel is so small, the time to get down into an air shelter from Siren was about 45 seconds. As you might know, Israeli homes all by law have to have a bunker in the house, in the basement, and apartment buildings have to have either a bunker or easy community access. But 45 seconds, if you can imagine waking up with your two young children and getting into one of these places is near impossible. So families ended up sleeping during the period in the bunkers. They would just come in the air raid shelters and put out a sleeping bag and sleep there. You know, there's two sides that we can always look at this. Is this a sign of Israeli resilience that they adapt? But we shouldn't over romanticize resilience, because resilience means that you're hurting, you're resilient despite the pain that you're experiencing. I remember at the time, again, the economic hit to Israel was also tremendous. Tourism became virtually non-existent. I would fly to Israel on near empty flights. And we would go to restaurants in secret restaurants at the time. So they were, restaurateurs started opening up in warehouses and bunkers and businesses that didn't look like a restaurant. No signs, you knew where it was. You would go through a security gate. A guard would open your trunk. They'd look at you because there is profiling and you either look Israeli or you look like an Arab. You might be asked for your ID, usually not, but sometimes yes. And then you would go to this secret restaurant. Again, it's resilience, it's adaptive. But I also remember I was at Tel Aviv University and there's a restaurant right outside the gate. And I was there with 8 or 10 faculty members. A lot of them younger, who had young children. And you could see how anxious they were. And we started talking about it. And they said, we haven't been in a restaurant for a year, for 2 years. We don't take buses. We don't allow our children to take buses. Now, others obviously did not have the economic means to have, in Israel, what's called a private, which means your own car. So had to continue taking buses. And I would go on the buses and you could just see the anxiety people experienced. Our studies showed very high levels of PTSD in the population, enormously high. PTSD sits in the population in general at about 1.5%, 2%, and we would find 12 to 17% among Israelis. I would also mention there's also another side of this, and that's the Palestinian experience. Because among Palestinians, PTSD was much higher than that. And I don't say that taking sides. I've clearly taken my side. I was an officer in the Israeli army and not in the Palestinian forces. But I also understand that it was highly traumatic for the Palestinians. I understand what it's like. I was an occupying force in the West Bank. I was on platoons, on patrols, completely weaponized, 8, 12, 30 men going through the shuk, the market, ourselves feeling vulnerable, but carrying weapons of destruction at the same time. Machine gun I carried, released, I think, forget exactly now, but 30 bullets in about a second and a half. There's 30 of us. We're carrying grenade launchers. So we also have to recall that this experience is one of two sides at war with each other. And And it is a kind of war. It's not a parallel war. It is a traditional fighting force against a non-traditional fighting force. I can tell you that part of my work in the Army was to make sure the Army did not create more terrorists, if at all possible, meaning getting the Army to behave themselves with the strictest decorum. Israel has a very unusual policy. Almost every army in the world fires first and asks questions later. When an army enters a home, not the Israeli army, you throw in a grenade first, you fire a spray of machine gun fire next, and then you enter the room. Israelis' army enters the room without the grenade and without the spray of bullets. But you're still carrying weapons of destruction, entering families' home in a very delicate and sad dance. Some other things that I thought about of the Intifada is that we found that in our studies that the more close your experience were to death or injury of a loved one, the more right-wing you became. True of both Palestinians and Jews. So the experience of PTSD is one of creating a cycle of anger, greater political distrust, and more support for overreaction. I would also mention that there are Israeli terrorists. You hear much less about them, but a big problem for the Israeli security forces are the Hill Boys, which are yeshiva boys who act as terrorists and terrorize the Arab population. They are a problem also because they enter the army and try to infiltrate this very negative way of acting into others in the military. An excellent film that I really recommend that you can see on television on demand it's called Commandments in English, Kipot Barzel in Hebrew. It's about a religious Jewish men who are in the army and their experience, including the Hilltop Boys. Have any of you seen that film?
We showed some episodes of it in our previous seasons.
Yeah, really, really well done. When I was in the army, we did not have this influence. My only problem in the army was that the religious soldiers insisted that they be the one to drive the Jeep or the whatever vehicle we're on Shabbos, because they can drive on the Shabbat for Pikuach Nefesh, the guardian of souls, but only for the guardian of souls. And if I might drive as a secular Jew, I might veer off to pick up a falafel, and picking up a falafel is not Pikuach Nefesh. But other than driving us a little crazy with things like that, and a couple times refusing the food we had because they decided that it wasn't kosher enough and we were very hungry, this was not an experience that we had. You know, so much of this is, you know, if anyone hits a golf ball in a closed room, everyone in the room is going to get injured eventually by the whacking golf ball. And things have calmed down quite a bit in Israel right now, but the Intifada was definitely a period of whacking golf balls. The last thing I'll mention before inviting your comments or questions is this was a time, the Intifada you all know the adage that correlation does not mean causation, but it was a time of great divisions of Israeli society, and many of these schisms continue till today. So we had a great dividing between the right and left, the Netanyahu and right-wing individuals and movements, and the Labor, Mapam, other liberal movements dividing further apart. Also, perhaps unrelated, but causing further strife, a great broadening of the wealthy versus the haves versus have-nots, because many Israelis began being very successful in different high-tech ventures, especially becoming multimillionaires, building incredible mansions, whereas others were left with perhaps not less, but less in comparison. And then a great divide between religious and secular. In fact, some historians and sociologists have said that the Intifada saved Israel from a civil war between the religious and the secular. Conjecture, but at least it's a point that many intelligent minds have made. Since we're busy fighting them, we're not going to fight each other. Today, I think that that divide is further widening. And I just saw some film the other day from Israel during the Day of the Women, with demonstrations against that by Haredi, in other words, ultra-Orthodox. And then they were confronted by secular Jewish women who raised their blouses and bared their breasts, or at least I think they kept their bras on in this case, and the Haredi Jews scattered. But the fact is, they felt a need to protest the Day of the Woman, a sign of a very great divide in the society, where, of course, in especially the secular society, women are a powerful force in really every aspect of Israeli society, from politics to business to medicine to law, etc. So those are my imperfect comments and reactions. It's intelligent, thoughtful group, or you wouldn't be watching a film like this and wanting to talk about it. So I invite your comments or questions.
Feel free to either just unmute yourself and speak up, or you can enter a question in the chat. I was curious, do you have some thoughts on what the impact of the Intifada, what effect did it, and if you could, I don't know if you can refresh our memories on what caused it to end, but what effect did it ultimately?
It didn't, nothing caused to end, it petered out. Probably a combination of hitting the terrorist cells, but also, it was very much a demonstration of grassroots, and just lost energy. There's only so many times you can go to the streets and nothing changes, nothing happens. I think that's the best we can say about it.
You just lost steam.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you think the film is saying about Ronan? Is it that the effect of the PTSD is that he's essentially infantilized himself, and that what the film is demonstrating is that through taking a chance at love, he's making some effort to combat the PTSD? I mean, what is the film
Yeah,
strategy in terms
yeah,
of dealing with the Intifada?
very, very interesting comments. You know, PTSD doesn't make you immature. My guess is he was pretty immature all along. You know, you're not great with women, and then you get PTSD, and now you're terrible with women. He was awkward. He's kind of a nebbish. It's never clear that he has a job. I didn't see any mention of work. That may have been no need to mention it. He obviously lives on something. It didn't happen. The PTSD didn't happen as a soldier, so he doesn't get. He's not getting compensation as an injured warrior. He also, by the way, doesn't mention any army service that I remember, which, you know, and perhaps he didn't even serve, although he doesn't seem that disturbed to me. But I think you're right that the relationship, having a more adult relationship, he doesn't have an adult relationship with his father, who treats him as a child, and his father's also a child. And the woman that he meets is his friend is not an adult. The woman's his first adult that we meet. And perhaps this silent Japanese character that follows him on the tours is this other alter ego, perhaps. So yeah, I think those themes are running there. The rekindling of the relationship is what relieves his PTSD, if you will, or at least allows him to stop, to re-enter life more fully, which is implied and not explicit even at the end of the film. We know he gives up giving the tours.
At one point, Ronen and Asya have this conversation where Ronen remarks, "We don't even have a name for this thing." And you and I discussed this a little bit, that, you know, it was, even the Israelis called it the Intifada.
Yeah.
But is there some sort of, you know, to what extent is there a national repression or national PTSD of Israel as a country having gone through this period?
It was an interesting question again. It was certainly a period where we saw, if you will, mental health in general is a bell curve. And the whole bell curve shifted over with increased depression, increased PTSD, increased anxiety, increased health problems. And again, in the more severe reactions for Palestinians, we saw a epidemic of type 2 diabetes developing in Palestinian children, which of course we usually don't see till the age of 50s and 60s. So anxiety is an inflammatory process, and it was probably cooking genetic predisposition to diabetes in the children in their much more severe exposure. And I think it's very important to understand the Palestinian experience as well. Minimally, even if you see, well, the Palestinians are just our enemy, well, you better understand your enemy. But if they are ever going to be potential partners, then certainly you must understand what's going on with your potential partner.
To the extent that exposure to violence nudges you to the right, I mean, one could say all of Israel has been nudged to the right.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
First,
and it's probably what kept Netanyahu in power.
Go ahead,
And he would
Steve.
use fear politics My last book was called Tribalism, The Evolutionary Origins of Fear Politics. And he definitely used that tool as a scare tactic to rally support for right-wing political gain. Some other questions
You mentioned that
Stanley?
Yes. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I was interested in the film from this point of view. And I agree with you, certainly. It looked like he was suffering from PTSD. When we saw him in bed, he was always in a sweat. No doubt he had had nightmares and so on. But I thought that he chose a rather ingenious way of doing self-therapy, if you like. I mean, normally a person under this kind of condition would seek out professional help. Doesn't look like he did that. But here, what he did was what we call like prolonged exposure or successive approximations, which we know is helpful with PTSD, exposing himself to these different places, working up to, you know, the worst of it at Sbarro's. So I was a bit surprised to hear you say that. I don't know whether you get this from some empirical studies or your own experience, that this kind of thing rarely works. Now, it's true he's not processing it. He's not seeing a therapist and so on, but he must be processing it in his own way by exposing himself. I just wondered what you thought about that. And the movie does show him doing better.
I agree with you, Stanley. I think that's what it was showing, and that's what was happening. And that does work for some. The research does show that most just stay in it, just never get better. It just again, for him, it was that and the young woman that were the two keys that happened for him. So, and of course, this is a study of an N of 1. So his experience was that it may have very well helped him get through it.
Okay. Yeah, the way, you know, anyway, I'll stop here. Yeah.
So this movie portrays Jerusalem as a place that has sort of forgotten or repressed the Intifada. No one but Ronan seems to be actively interested in it. We understand that there are plaques, but nobody looks at the plaques. People just sort of walk past them. So do you think that the movie is accurate in that? And if so, what is its significance?
Yes, I think it is. You know, those that were obviously closest to the Intifada's impact. So if you lost a loved one, then you're impacted for life. If you've been injured yourself, you're likely deeply impacted. But if you were in danger, but now you're not, and a period of years has passed, which is what the case for the majority of people, then yes, you get over it and you get on with life. And that's my experience of being in Israel post-Intifada.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, in Israel, one never forgets because you have military service, you have an ongoing threat going on. We can agree or disagree on the solutions to that. But you're always in the mix. So although you've gone past the Intifada, that doesn't mean you've gone past history, because you're living history. You're not coming home out of the war zone.
Is there, one of the questions we got is, given a little bit back to the topic of pushing things to the right or pushing people who've experienced violence to the right. Is there a way to undo that nudge to the right? Or I don't know if you've any of your research sheds light on that.
Well, it often occurs through a process of a natural process. Now we have actually, oddly, a rather right-wing prime minister who is, though not a fanatic, and he's part of a coalition government in which he has to represent the coalition being centrist. In my estimation, doing a good job of that. It's a very difficult balancing act, as one can imagine. And that pulls the society back towards the center. We also have to remember that the Israeli move to the right was created only and entirely by the influx of 1 million+ Russian Jews. The left was slightly dominant until their arrival. They are the vast majority right wing, and they tip the scales. Any thought of word of socialism, which Netanyahu would use, brings a reflexive reaction to them of horror. And also there's a tendency to have the kind of reaction that some Israelis have anyway, which is the only thing an Arab is going to understand is a fist. And that's very much a Russian viewpoint. That's what we see in, Russian army politics. It's not there's no finesse in the Russian army. They've lost all of their recent wars on the finesse side and only won in the last 30 years by massive destruction. So the iron fist is the thing that was learned, and that really is what most greatly affected the balance. The fact that a centrist was elected was probably as much anti-Netanyahu among the young people as anti-right-wing philosophy. He became a pariah through his own actions to many of the population, through corrupt acts or perceived corrupt acts. Well, actually, pretty clear that he participated in corrupt acts.
You mentioned people being afraid to eat in restaurants, afraid to go out. That's not too dissimilar to what we have just lived through. How does it's not the same, it's not sudden and violent, but how is it similar to what we've just been through with COVID?
Yeah, I think there are similarities there, and it might be a way that you empathize as you journey back to restaurants and feel uncomfortable in getting back into that, or perhaps some of you have gone back down to the symphony orchestra again, and there's some feelings of trepidation, even triple inoculated and masked up and everything. So at least it's an avenue for empathy.
Okay. And any other
Yes,
questions?
Carolyn.
Go ahead. Carolyn, unmute yourself.
You're muted. You have to hit the mute button on the bottom.
There.
Okay. At the end of the film, he uses the mask and goes into the water. Was that an attempt at almost like getting rid of his troubles, or trying to get rid of his troubles by going into the water? Like a feeling of cleansing himself, for example?
Yeah, I thought it was, the before Shabbat mikvah.
Like a mikvah.
Yeah, another interpretation I thought is re-entering life again. You know, that there's an old Jewish joke that God comes to the world and says, probably all heard this, so I'm not telling you a new joke, I don't think, but and says, I've had it with you all, there's going to be a flood, and this time it's forever. And the Catholics get together and say, how are we going to give confession? And the Protestants beat their chests over their past sins. And the rabbis get together and say, okay, how are we going to live underwater? I thought that that was part of why she gave him the mask with the snorkel, is it's time for you to start living underwater. And joining me on the vacation, I thought it was odd that she wasn't there also, but that's where it left it in this unknown, murky area for me.
This is the 20th year of our Jewish film series, and one thing I've learned is that Israeli movies don't usually end on an unambiguously triumphant note. They often end with like, okay, it's over.
Well, that's how we can argue. Yes, Stanley.
So I enjoyed the film, by the way. I was just very taken by it, the characters and so on. But one thing I found peculiar was this Japanese fellow following Ronen wherever he went. You know, like Ma Pitom. What is this about?
Yeah. Again, I had the one interpretation that he was working on his own stuff. And the other thing I thought about was that was somehow his alter ego, the silent witness watching. But it was certainly odd.
A question relating back to the discussion of COVID. Do you think there's any doubling up on the Israeli population of having gone through all the violence and trauma and also then going through COVID? Is there some additional effect of that?
No, I don't think so in that way. But the odd thing in Israel is there is a very large movement of anti-vaxxers who are liberal left that's emerged. And they're very strong, very outspoken, have had many demonstrations. Haven't seen a word of it in the news here, but if you follow Israeli media, you hear about it. It's taken over many of my friends who are very intelligent, highly educated, very left-wing, and they see this as a part of right-wing tactics. In America, it's become the anti-vaxxers are seeing it as they're anti-left. In Israel, the anti-vaxxers are anti-right. So,
well, Hebrew goes from right to left. So.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, Gittel, you want to unmute yourself?
So just apropos, Udi, to what you said about the way the movie leaves you with, if you read, I'm in the middle of it, but I've gotten to this point already of reading Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews. She talks about how in Jewish literature, there really is a lot of this empty, open-ended ending to books and to stories, not these nice little things tied up in a bow. So you might want to look at that and see how that follows through with your thoughts.
Yeah. I also have one novel. If you haven't read enough Jewish literature, it's called The Imperfect Guardian. It's available on Amazon. It's gotten great reviews. Not that it's sold a lot of books. It's my grandfather's story as told by me, fictionalized. From about 1906 to 1922, meaning it's a lot of your perhaps parents or grandparents' story as well. People have written very positively about the book. The Imperfect Guardian.
Okay. Thank you.
It's the idea that we try to be imperfect guardians. I was going to show you a few photos. Me as a young man in the Army, but also, you know, as to Israeli leadership through this whole thing, I was, you know, very much involved in working with the chiefs of staff, the 16 senior members of the Israeli security establishment, and I just remember that at several meetings, Dan Chalutz, who was at the time a 2-star general, it's not stars in Israel, but the equivalent, a major general, and he would take off his, he would just ignore the experts. He would ignore any, he was the one that had the famous statement. He was the chief of the Air Force, and a journalist asked him, "Doesn't it bother you to have Israeli planes bombing civilian targets?" And his answer was, "Yes, it vibrates the wings." He's the one that became the chief of staff during the Lebanon War. And then, if you remember then what happened, he's the one where he should have been preparing for the engagement in Lebanon, was on the phone with his stockbroker, selling and buying stocks, and caught doing it. So at the time, the other generals I worked with were not like that, but then you had a right-wing government choosing him because he was most associated with the right, and how disastrous he was. So all these things are background to, there's in our political leaders, there's those we agree with and those we disagree with, but then another factor is competence. And, we have the pretty disastrous presidency of Jimmy Carter, and an effective presidency, I use air quotes for me because I didn't like his politics, of Ronald Reagan, effective in the sense of passing the most legislation. So my point is there that part of the background of all this is, in a sense, you get lucky because you elect a leader, you don't know how competent they're going to be. You have some idea of their politics, but you don't know how competent they're going to be. And true also of those who are, in military leadership. We got very lucky, I think, during this last period, during the Trump administration, with some very good heads of the military in the United States. It might have gone otherwise had they been otherwise. So my dad, in the early part of his career, used to train professional athletes, and he used to say, you got to be lucky and you got to be good. So that's also the case of whether it's Israel or the United States, you got to be good and you got to be lucky. And, it's a big part of what happens is bad luck of how things turn at times as well. So.
Thank you. This has been any other questions? If not, I think this has been a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate